Welcome to GeoWars Explained, where every war is not just a story. Disclaimer, this channel provides commentary and analysis on historical and crumps.
Every empire that came here thought the same thing. This map makes sense. They were all wrong.
They had the ships, the armies, the maps. So why did every empire fail? 17,000 islands, no center, no control. That's why no empire could hold Indonesia.
The Dutch captain looked at his map and saw an empire. What the map did not show him was that the empire was looking back. He had sailed from Rotterdam with 35 vessels and orders to pacify a region 3 times the size of Western Europe. The orders assumed a center. The center did not exist. In 1628, Mataram forces besieged the Dutch settlement at Batavia, not because they wanted the port, but because they could not allow anyone else to hold it. The siege lasted months, the supply lines collapsed, and the Mataram army eventually withdrew. But the Dutch did not gain what they assumed they had taken. They had only moved the pressure point to a different island. The archipelago absorbed the attempt without contracting. This is the question that has defined 3 centuries of geopolitical failure in Southeast Asia. Why does every foreign power that enters the Indonesian archipelago eventually find itself managing a situation it cannot resolve? Not losing in a single decisive engagement. Not repelled by a superior military force, simply, steadily becoming irrelevant inside a territory it nominally controls. 17,000 islands, more than 700 distinct languages, a combined maritime coastline longer than the circumference of the Earth. These numbers are facts about geography, and geography is the beginning of the answer, but it is not the whole answer. Indonesia does not defend itself by being strong. It defends itself by being impossible to hold. To understand the structure of that impossibility, it is necessary to stop looking at battles and start looking at systems. Every major attempt to control the Indonesian archipelago has followed an identical sequence. Identify the largest population center. Apply concentrated force. Extract administrative authority. Every time, that sequence encounters the same fundamental failure. The system does not have a single point of control available to seize. A Portuguese navigator named António de Abreu reached the Banda Islands in 1512. He found nutmeg. He found trade networks stretching from China to the Arabian Peninsula. What he did not find was a unified political authority whose agreement could unlock the archipelago. There were dozens of sultanates, each sovereign, each connected by water rather than by roads. This distinction carries more weight than it appears to. Road-based empires, Rome, the Mongols, the British in India, control territory by controlling the roads, because whoever holds the roads holds the logistics chain. Whoever holds the logistics chain holds the army's ability to move and resupply itself. The formula is ancient, reliable, and well-tested. It simply does not apply where the roads are water and every island can be provisioned independently. The first structural constraint of Indonesia is therefore not military. It is architectural. The 17,000 islands do not form a river valley that can be dammed at its narrowest crossing, or a peninsula that can be pinched from 2 sides simultaneously. They form a net. A net, by its nature, cannot be seized by gripping a single strand, because the force distributes through the remaining strands and the net continues to function. The Portuguese navigator returned to Lisbon with his spices. The system continued without him. The second structural constraint is what historians of Southeast Asia call the problem of scale without coherence. An empire requires a functioning administrative hierarchy, a chain of command capable of translating an order from a capital into consistent action at the periphery. In the Indonesian archipelago, that hierarchy has never held across the full territory. The distance between Java and the easternmost coast of Papua equals roughly the distance between London and Tehran. Within that span, there are more than 300 distinct ethnic groups, each with their own systems of authority, land tenure, and social obligation. A Dutch colonial officer named Herman Willem Dendels attempted to impose centralized French-style administration on Java in the early 19th century. He built the Great Post Road, over 1,000 kilometers of highway in 5 years of continuous construction. The men who built it died in numbers he himself declined to record precisely. The road functioned, and Java, for a limited period, operated as a single administrative unit. But Java is one island, and there are 16,999 others. The arithmetic of this constraint is not dramatic. It is grinding. Every system that attempts to govern the archipelago from a single center confronts the same unavoidable calculation: the cost of maintaining administrators across the full range of distinct communities, multiplied by the number of communities across the full territory, consistently exceeds any extractable surplus. The conquest becomes economically self-defeating before it becomes militarily untenable. The empire begins to cost more than it produces. The third constraint is maritime logistics, and it requires precision because it is frequently misread as simply a defensive advantage of island geography. The Dutch had one of the most powerful naval forces in human history and crossed the water repeatedly without difficulty. The constraint is not crossing the water. Every subsequent movement from one island to another after landing requires another full naval operation. Supply lines are not roads. They are exposed to monsoon timing, to piracy, to the compounding unpredictability of wind and current. A garrison on one island cannot reinforce a garrison 2 islands away in hours. It may take weeks. In that interval, local systems quietly reassert themselves. There was a Vach accountant, his name does not survive in standard colonial records, who submitted a report in 1720, noting that the cost of maintaining administrative outposts across the outer islands exceeded the revenue extracted from those outposts by a factor of 4. He recommended consolidation to the company directors. The outer islands were never fully consolidated. They continued operating under their own internal logic, not because they militarily repelled Dutch authority, but because the full delivery of Dutch authority across all of them was too expensive to sustain indefinitely. The fourth constraint is the most difficult to quantify, and the one that ultimately determines the outcome of every other calculation. In centralized polities, political identity travels vertically. The village identifies with the district with the province with the capital. In the Indonesian archipelago, identity does not move this way. It moves laterally, through shared language, shared agricultural practice, shared ecological relationship. A Balinese farmer's primary institutional loyalty is not to a state. It is to the subak, the ancient cooperative irrigation network that has organized Balinese agriculture for over 1,000 years. The subak does not require government registration. It does not appear on any colonial administrative map. It functions regardless of who nominally holds authority over the land above it. No colonial administration ever had enough local agents to reach every subak. The gap between nominal control and functional control was never closed. It was managed at great cost and never resolved. By the middle of the 20th century, every colonial calculation in the Indonesian archipelago had arrived at the same terminal point. The Dutch had formally claimed the Indies since 1602, 3.5 centuries of accumulated investment in infrastructure, administration, and military force. In August 1945, 2 days after the Japanese surrender, Sukarno and Hatta declared Indonesian independence. The declaration required a microphone, a flag, and approximately 4 minutes. The Dutch returned and fought a 4-year military campaign, the Colonial Acties, to re-establish administrative control. They won the majority of conventional engagements. They held the cities and the port facilities. They could not translate battlefield success into political authority, because the network of local committees, councils, and community structures that had reorganized during the Japanese occupation was not a military structure. It could not be dismantled the way armies are dismantled. The Dutch found themselves holding the coordinates on a map and not controlling what happened at those coordinates. It is worth pausing once on what this cost in human terms. The men on both sides of those engagements, Dutch conscripts and Indonesian fighters, did not design the system they were operating inside, and they could not exit it on the basis of individual choice. A Javanese villager who joined a Republican guerrilla network was not primarily acting on geopolitical theory. He was acting because the administrative boundary of his village had begun speaking a foreign language, and his community's internal organization, its land arrangements, its water rights, its seasonal labor obligations, did not recognize the authority of that language. The system produced behavior that looked like armed resistance. In structural terms, it was the continuation of something that had always been present. That continuity is what no external force has ever been able to interrupt permanently. Not the Portuguese, not the Dutch, not the Japanese, not, ultimately, anyone. What came next closed every remaining door. The moment of structural recognition for every empire that has entered the archipelago does not arrive at the point of military defeat. It arrives at the point of administrative exhaustion, when the governing power acknowledges that genuine control costs more than nominal control is worth, and that the local systems below the administrative surface do not require the empire's permission to continue functioning. The Japanese occupation from 1942 to 1945 demonstrates this with unusual clarity, because Japan arrived not as a declining power, but as an expansionist empire at its regional peak. It displaced Dutch administrative structures within months, mobilized Indonesian labor and agricultural output at scales the Dutch had never achieved, and imposed a single chain of command across the territory. When the Japanese surrender came, the nationalist networks that had developed underneath the occupation, building administrative capacity, training local officials, establishing communication between islands, were operationally prepared to declare a state within 48 hours. The occupation had not interrupted Indonesian political organization. It had accelerated it by eliminating the colonial layer that had previously divided nationalist coordination. The empire provided the structural opening. The indigenous system provided the momentum. This is the lock-in condition. The archipelago does not require its occupiers to be defeated in open battle. It requires only that its internal systems continue operating long enough for the occupier's administrative patience to expire. Every conquering power has eventually reached that limit. The archipelago has not reached its own. The correct question is not why Indonesia resisted conquest. That framing implies a deliberate strategy, a decision taken, a resistance organized, a sacrifice chosen. The more precise question is why the form of control that external powers have consistently sought in the archipelago is structurally incompatible with the way the archipelago is organized. Geography distributes political pressure across 17,000 separate points, none sufficient on its own to determine the condition of the whole. Cultural heterogeneity prevents any administrative hierarchy from achieving universal compliance across 300 distinct ethnic communities. Maritime logistics make sustained supply chains economically irrational across the full territory over any extended time frame. And local governance systems from the Balinese subak to the Javanese village council to the Akanese adat operate at a resolution below the level at which external authority can consistently reach. No empire has had enough administrators to cover every subak. None has had a logistics chain capable of supplying every outpost through multiple monsoon cycles indefinitely. None has sustained the political patience required to outlast a system that measures its own continuity in agricultural generations rather than in electoral terms. These outcomes are not coincidences. They are the predictable outputs of a specific geographic and social architecture that precedes every empire that has ever attempted to impose itself upon it. In 1949, the Netherlands formally recognized Indonesian sovereignty at the Round Table Conference in The Hague. The Indonesian delegation, sat across a conference table from the Dutch government. The conference lasted 10 weeks. The diplomats who signed the transfer documents were not transferring something that the Dutch fully and completely possessed. They were acknowledging something that had always been structurally true. The system had never fully changed hands. Somewhere on the slopes of a volcano in central Java, a farmer was adjusting the gate of an irrigation channel. The channel ran where it had run for 800 years. The names of the governments above him had changed more than 12 times in that interval. The water moved exactly where the subak required it to move. The archive of territories that have resisted permanent external control is longer than any single case suggests. The record continues.
Subscribe for channel for new updates.